Hello and welcome. I am Jessica Kimble-Johnson, and I'm the Director of Research and the manager of the Now Lab on the History and Principles of Democracy at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. I'm delighted to introduce another conversation today that is part of our Touchstones of Democracy series. The series focuses on key events, places, thinkers, and texts that help us understand the history, principles, and practices of democracy. Today's conversation will be on rethinking representation and will feature political science professors and scholars of democratic thought, Kevin Duong of UVA and Helene Landemore of Yale University. Kevin is the author of The Virtues of Violence, Democracy Against Disintegration in Modern France. He is currently working on another book called The Revolution of the Ballot, which reconstructs the notion of the voice of the people during the struggles for universal suffrage. Helene has written a number of books and most recently co-authored Debating Democracy, in which she argues against her co-author that we need more rather than less democracy. She has advised the parliaments of Finland and France on inclusive policy and decision-making efforts. In some cases, those efforts have included the involvement of a random selection of citizens who participate in deliberation and decision-making. Today, we are focusing our conversation on her book, Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century, which was published by Princeton University Press. One last note before we begin is that about midway through the conversation today, Kevin and Helene will take audience questions, so please feel free to submit those using the Q&A function. And with that, I will ask the both of you an opening question and then hand the conversation over to Kevin to guide from there. So thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate seeing you. This first question is very broad, but hopefully it will start to point us in the right direction. And that is, most people associate democracy with elections. Are we wrong in doing so?
So who's going first?
I mean, I haven't maybe an unsatisfying first take, which would be my immediate answer would be no. Of course, I'm partly persuaded by the book that we're actually talking about today, and we know that democracy doesn't have to necessarily be related to elections because of what we know about ancient democracy, partly for that reason. And I assume this is what we're going to mostly talk about today, and this is some of the questions I'll be asking Helene, which is that we could reimagine how we do elections so that they are more assembly-like. And so I wouldn't answer that question in an absolutist way. But I think probably a lot of the work to be done in the future would be to rethink how to run elections so that they're less like elections, actually.
Okay, so for the sake of provocation, I'm going to say, yes, we're wrong to associate democracy with elections, if by elections we mean just and only the ability to choose our rulers and our representatives. I think democracy is about so much more, and this very limited understanding has been, I think, leading us to this kind of dead-end street, like this feeling that the system is broken, that it can't be changed, and I think that a lot of the things that we focus on are symptoms of a more fundamental problem, which is the way we select our representatives. I don't think it's an accident that we end up with a tiny group of people self-perpetuating in power that's highly unrepresentative, actually, descriptively of the larger population. It's better in some countries, but I think structurally, election will always distribute power unequally and to people who tend to be at the top of the social and economic hierarchy. So that's fundamentally irreconcilable with the idea of equal power. So I'm not saying we should not vote. I think voting is crucial and important, but we should vote on issues. And we should consider switching to a model of selection of the people who represent us. That's based on random selection, because in that case, you at least ensure that everyone stands a chance to access power, and you make sure that the people who are chosen look like us, think like us, and produce policies that are much closer to what we need and actually want.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Kevin, I will hand the conversation over to you.
Sure. maybe I'll just start with a kind of general question, especially for listeners who may not have read the book. One of the things I love about the framing of the book, I was actually just talking with Jessica about this too as we were getting ready, is that a lot of people, when they talk about contemporary crises of democracy, they talk about it in terms of great pessimism. But one of the opening moves of your book is to say, but what if we actually approach the crisis of democracy as evidence of frustrated ambitions, democratic ambitions among the wider population that in many ways your book is trying to honor and extend. And so I guess just as an opening question, and also so that listeners can get a bit more familiarity with the spirit of your book, if you could say more about why you chose to frame your book that way, to kind of turn the classic crisis of democracy narrative around to say, what if the crisis of democracy is because people want more of it? And what happens if you start taking that seriously?
Thank you, Kevin. That's a really nice way of entering the book. I think one part of the reason why I focus on the opportunity rather than the crisis per se is that I think it's temperamental. I tend to see the glass half full, and that sometimes is a problem. But the other reason is that I do see around me, and I've observed empirically, democratic innovations that have given me so much hope. And when you leave that sort of high level narrative about the crisis of democracy, and when you your gaze moves away from the focus on politicians and the great men and the corrupt men actually often, and you look at actual people, ordinary citizens going about their lives, and you realize there's so much energy, common sense, generosity, wisdom, desire to help and do something that I think if we tapped into that, there would be the sky would be the limit. I just don't think our structures are currently capable of tapping all that wisdom and energy. So I've looked at an experiment in Finland of crowdsourcing where we asked people to come online and share their views about how to reform a law on snowmobile regulation of snowmobile and come up with ideas about how to make it better. I've spent 9 months observing the Citizens Convention for Climate in France last year. And I mean, it just made me more sure. I came to this with somewhat abstract, formal, ideas based on formal models and all of that, and the history of political thought. But now, having looked at what actual people are capable of, I just think that there's an opportunity there, and there's a demand as well. Meaning, when you open those spaces for democratic participation and you do it in the right way, meaning in a way that respects people, values their time and their ideas, and make sure that there's going to be an impact, they come and they're eager, and even if they're skeptical at the beginning, as some still are because they've been so disillusioned by decades of not being taken seriously or not feeling that they matter, they get transformed through these deliberative processes. And so I think that that's what we should look at, and we should stop looking at the foam of politics, all that nonsense on CNN and this horse race, and just look at actual people doing things.
I actually thought it was really appropriate that you opened your book with this, one of my favorite passages from Du Bois, where he's talking about the collective wisdom of the people. And sometimes when we think about the collective wisdom of the people, we think of it in almost like statistical terms. So what Du Bois is talking about is much closer to what you just said, which is that the point of democratic politics is that people are changed by participating in power, and that activates a particular kind of intelligence that they kind of had in potential. But it's not the collective intelligence of the people, something that you nurture precisely through what you in the book actually defend as participation rights. One of my favorite, it's a line that, because I read the book, on page 49, you have this line that kind of stopped me in my tracks, because it's a very different way of talking about what's valuable about the masses than what I think a lot of political science literature talks about. It's this wonderful line where you say, you're criticizing this idea that a lot of scholars have, that the power of the people is primarily through their powers of observation, that the people are kind of a watchful and vigilant defender of the democratic process. And you actually say, quote, overestimating what the gaze can do alone. This is a problem, you say, is that because it downplays the centrality of voice
Yeah.
in the ideal of democracy. And I was totally stopped in my tracks with that, because then I wanted to know what you think voice is, why voice there as opposed to sight, and what for you is so distinctive about the people's voice that you think is actually underappreciated by other scholars of democracy, especially the ones who are talking about the crisis of democracy today.
Right. So I just want for the viewers to read this quote by Du Bois, because I also totally fell in love with it. So it reads like this.
It's a great one.
The vast and wonderful knowledge of this universe is locked in the bosoms of its individual souls. To tap this mighty reservoir of experience, knowledge, beauty, love, and deed, we must appeal not to the few, not to some souls, but to all. The real argument for democracy is then that in the people we have the source of that endless life and unbounded wisdom which the rulers of men must have. And honestly, it's not just close to what I'm saying. It's actually much bigger. I wish I had like that ambition actually for the argument. I focus on the cognitive epistemic aspects, like what can people who put their minds together achieve in terms of like figuring out the fact and maybe the moral truth about something. But he envisioned something even larger. Like it's like the truth of the universe. It's like beauty, love, deed. I mean, it's like it's very spiritual, and
Yeah.
and I think he's right. It's just using the tools of social science like I try to do. It's kind of like hard to pin down these larger notions, but I think that's what we should aim for. We should aim for a vision of democracy as a way of life where we're like embarked together on this journey, and we respect each other, love each other in this in this sense of like civic friendship, and which is what I observed in certain spaces of democratic innovations, and the opposite of the sort of like bitter rhetoric and partisanship that we see in the realm of what we call politics today. So that's just to sort of situate the quote by Du Bois. But I think why I care so much about voice is because that's what should be the core of a functional democracy. Like, what do people want? What do they say they want? And that's what we should take seriously. But that's not what we're doing with an electoral system, which is focused on aggregating votes at best. And not even votes on issues, but votes on candidates that are not chosen by us, but by party leadership in groups that are, very top-down, very hierarchical, have internal rules that are opaque and not democratic at all. So it's, I mean, I could go back to the whole history of representative democracy. This was our regime forms today were not born as democracies. They were born as, better alternatives to monarchies, which is an improvement certainly, but they were also designed as alternatives to democracy, as ruled by the mob at the time that's how it was conceived of. And I think there's something else than ruled by the mob, which is authentic democracy, where voice is central. There are spaces, structured spaces for deliberation that's inclusive, respectful of all individuals. And so that I think that's what's missing from our conversations. I think we're stuck in this 20th century approach, which is very elitist. The thinkers that have shaped the way we think, especially in political science department in the US. I would say I think it's a bit different elsewhere, but in the US it's incredibly elitist. It's Schumpeter, it's economic theories of democracy which compare voters to consumers, have a very passive role for most people, because they're conceived as interchangeable pawns who are easily manipulated by the media, by elites, and are just there to create some random shock at regular intervals so that the elites don't get too cozy. But like, there's no idea of collective intelligence, no sense that we should cultivate participation. On the contrary, these authors thought that actually the more apathy there is, the more people stay away from politics, the better, because they're too irrational, they're too ignorant. We need the good people in charge, and I think that's if you follow that logic to its natural conclusion, you end up with very anti-democratic conclusions, actually.
I mean, one of the things I mean, what you just said reminded me, I mean, I think it's running through the entire book. You are one of those scholars for whom it is there's a very clear difference between liberalism and democracy, which is, in political science departments, I likewise am driven crazy about this, like the endless conflation between liberalism and democracy. And what your book does so well is to say, actually, the difference is, it's both historical and it's momentous in its impact if you continue to conflate them. And it tracks a little bit the Du Bois quote, I think, because you use this phrase, I think Du Bois actually sometimes uses too, because he gets from the American pragmatist, that democracy is actually a way of life. It has ethical substance and it is lived and patterned in ordinary life. So it can't just be a set of institutions or a set of procedures that you implement once every 4 years. I think one of the really, I was very sympathetic to the critique that you make in your book, but I think it'll be shocking to a lot of readers, is that you specifically target both electoral democracy as actually more liberal than democratic. Yeah. And in particular, the idea that I think you even call it the end all be all of democracy as consent to your government. And, for, especially in the United States, in which like the notion of consent is fetishized, like,
absolutely.
Crazy. Like, absolutely. To tell us more about like, what's wrong with consent?
And I want to preface this by saying that I drank the Kool-Aid for many, many years. It took me 20 years to like sort of disintoxicate myself from that notion of democracy, from that notion of liberalism as pretty much the same thing as democracy, from that notion that consent is the end all, of all values. And but I've come to realize consent is choice. And democracy, is also about choice, but it's primarily about equality. And sometimes choice gets in the way of equality. So if you let people choose their rulers or their representatives, the nature of human choice is that it will converge on salient people, visible people, people who can buy visibility. So you end up with a very unequal distribution of power. And that's not compatible with equality. So sometimes I think it would be, so sometimes there's a trade-off between choice and equality. And if we're serious about being Democrats, we should choose choice first. And that, of course, to liberals is anathema, because to them, choice comes first. Individuals come first, not the collective, right? So you always sacrifice equality to choice, and you end up with, the logic of the markets. We're all free, right, in the market. We do whatever we want, and then the outcome of those interactions and this freedom is that we have very, very large inequalities, but that's okay because equality is a secondary value. And I think that then you see that liberalism and democracy do not reach the same sort of conclusions. I mean, you can sort of find a balance between the two, which is what we try to achieve, but fundamentally these are different ideologies, and liberalism is much thinner. It's essentially about human rights, about property rights, I would say. It's about individuals. There's no notion of the collective in liberalism, and it's not a regime form. By itself, it's not sustainable as a way to organize society. It's just a precondition for certain goods we want. And I do value liberalism, of course, but I'm just saying it's not the same as democracy. And democracy, on the other hand, it's about the collective, it's about political equality. And it can be constrained by liberalism. It should be constrained by liberalism up to a point. But I think the way we've invented democracy, we've invented it within the constraint of choice-obsessed liberalism, atomizing liberalism, that has actually innervated the potential of democracy and blocked some roads for a more authentic democracy, or a democracy as a way of life. So that's my problem, is that as long as we sacralize the notion that we get to choose our rulers, for example, we make it impossible to distribute this power more equally, for example, through random selection, in a way that would actually be beneficial, I think, to all of us, and will actually increase our collective freedom.
That description to me sounds amazing, even though you're attacking the analogy between both political participation and consumption, which is itself one major kind of ideological lodestar of 20th century liberalism. And I think that comes across really clearly in the book, but you make this interesting move where you say, but the solution to that equation that we've so been indoctrinated into of voting as a form of consumption, the answer is actually not direct democracy. You double down, and but don't don't fall into, you even call it a myth of direct democracy. Can you unpack why, if we ought to reject electoral democracy as having a monopoly on what counts as democracy, why for you then direct democracy is not the right place to look for an antidote?
Because in short, I would say that direct democracy is too close for comfort to the mob rule that the founders of our representative government were opposed to. So that they were so afraid of that they came up with this more oligarchic system of electoral democracy, and I think that the problem with mass direct democracy, the way I understand it, is that you don't have enough space for deliberation, which means that it's just going to be an aggregation of views based on an agenda set by, well, that's very unclear. It's not clear that a mass of people that's not like capable of organizing and coming up with a sort of reasonable way of defining an agenda cannot be then manipulated by a tiny clique who's going to set the agenda for them. So there's always this risk with, I just don't think direct democracy is a viable system. It's viable at a very, very small scale, maybe a faculty meeting or perhaps a village or a tiny city. But like as soon as you expand, people don't have time to be involved in all the tasks that are required in a democracy. So you need a division of labor. As soon as you need a division of labor, you need a system of representation so that you entrust someone with the task of speaking on your behalf, acting on your behalf, making decisions on your behalf, legislating on your behalf. So I'm not opposed to representation. So my solution, my go-to solution is not, oh, well, then let's do everything ourselves and vote on everything. Because I'm a deliberative Democrat and I'm committed to the view that if we want our laws and policies to be not only good, but legitimate, they need to be processed through an exchange of reasons and arguments. And that cannot be done at the mass scale of millions of people for now. So part of my work, it's not in this book, but is trying to explore the potential of technologies to maybe one day make mass deliberation possible. But right now, it's just not within reach. So as long as it's not within reach, then we need to rely on representative schemes of some sort. So does that mean I'm opposed to any forms of direct democracy? No. But in the book, I talk about moments. So it's completely necessary, actually, to have moments of direct democracy, like referenda. In particular, I mean, mostly it's like mass voting, because you do need this authorization of, say, even the principle of random selection. Like you cannot, there's always the moment of the foundation, the beginning. For that, you do need consent. You do need consent and authorization. At the end of the day, liberal values really matter too, but that's just the beginning. And then the next step is, well, okay, so now we've authorized this principle of random selection, then let's agree to having, say, a permanent citizens assembly that in which we rotate people frequently, set the agenda for this coming year, and then some of the laws will be made by these people. Then they might, if there are big ticket items, say something like the equivalent of Brexit or a constitutional reform, they might go to the people for a larger vote or consultation. But I cannot see direct democracy as a viable system on its own. It can only be a moment within a representative system.
So I'm curious about this. So for listeners too, the book does this amazing job of drawing the distinction between direct democracy and what you specifically endorse as open democracy. And you say that for all the reasons you just enumerated, that direct democracy, it's difficult to scale. There are all these kind of problems that are well known about direct democracy. And you suggest that what you'd like to do, or what you favor, are these things, for example, like mini publics, which are open and equal. They're not designed, of course, to be scalable so that everyone participates at the exact same time, although maybe over time, everyone gets a chance to participate in a mini public. But your example of mini publics, and it reflects your commitments to deliberative democracy, are these kind of like very intense moments of collaboration, for example, in the Icelandic case, which I hope you can say more about, of deliberation. But I'm also partly curious, what about traditional organs of what liberals like to call civil society, and what is their relationship to what you are calling these kind of deliberative mini publics, these open moments of democratic deliberation. Because I'm thinking, for example, like unions. Are unions an example of direct democracy? Well, no, but are they these mini publics that you're talking about? Not quite either. But I'd like to think that historically they play such an important representative function for the working class, for the multiracial working class. They were places for people to form common bonds, to develop common interests, to learn how to actually stand in for one another through acts of solidarity. And so I'm just curious, like, A, to maybe say more about your understanding of these mini publics and how it matches onto kind of more traditional understandings of what you might call civil society.
Right. So let me first explain maybe the concept of the open mini public. The idea is to get a sample of the population that's roughly descriptive of it along all kinds of, demographic features. But ideally, you wouldn't have to like have quotas or things that essentialize people, because it's small. You kind of have to like it's an approximation of the ideal. But in theory, it's the view that we as individuals have an equal chance of being chosen. It's like a lottery. It's like being on a jury. It's like a jury on steroids, right? It's a very large group of maybe 500 people, maybe 1,000, like in ancient Greece. They had juries that were that large, actually. And then it's given a function of agenda setting, but then it can also delegate tasks to other juries that are also representative of the larger public. And that way you ensure that whatever problem comes at a given polity, it's first addressed through the lens, through a lens that more or less tracks the preferences of the larger public, like the way they would think, the way they would react to that particular problem. So because I feel like when you take the electoral lens, it's very slanted. So you take the the climate crisis, right? So how did elected assemblies or elected governments deal with it in France recently? Well, their first instinct was to go to an expert solution called the carbon tax, because we're told, price signal, very important. You need to increase the cost of polluting and emitting greenhouse gases and consuming carbon and all that. So that's what they did. That triggered a massive rebellion in France called the Yellow Vest movement, because the people in the parliament or in the government who made those decisions live in the center of cities. They're wealthy enough that €5 more at the pump each month makes no difference to their life. They just didn't get the impact of a solution like that. Not to mention the fact that it's quite regressive, because it's people who cannot afford to live in the city center that have the longest commute and pay more. So it's a double punishment for them. Well, where does that problem come from? From the fact that there are not enough low-income people in these parliaments, or people who have just the experience of living far away from everything, relying on their car for everything, and feeling like they're demonized. So I think that's what you get. I mean, the benefit you get with a random sample is that you track a lot more the people at the periphery, but generally speaking, you track in theory everyone, right? Everyone's preferences. And if you don't, then the idea is that you open even more through crowdsourcing mechanisms, through connections to other mini publics. You try to remain as inclusive as possible for as long as possible before a decision actually needs to be made. Okay, so now what about what's called organized civil society, unions, I don't know, think tanks, groups, lobbies, etc. Well, I think those are natural groups that will form in any society. The like-minded get together, have an agenda, pursue their interests there. But the problem is that, again, it's going to either based on elections. I think unions proceed on the basis of election to a degree, or self-appointment, or appointment by other groups. For example, the CESE, our third legislative chamber in France, is the place where organized civil society meets, and it's a bunch of people that are either appointed or elected by their organizations. So what happens? Well, we know the problem with that, both self-selection and election. I mean, election, I already talked about it. It will tend to converge on the dominant, like the people who, even when they're like from the, lower socioeconomic groups, it will be the most vocal, the most alpha, the most salient, the one most likely to actually climb the social ladder eventually. And self-selection, it's the same thing. I mean, there's a little bit more access there because in theory anyone can join, but you have to have the qualities to push yourself out there, or the motivation all the time. Sometimes it comes down to time. Who has time? Well, it won't be the single mother with 3 kids. She won't have time, so she'll never be present in these representatives associations of organized civil society. So that's the problem. So I think they have a role to play, and perhaps elected assemblies too may stay as a feature of a more open democracy. But my point is just simply to decenter those institutions instead of assuming that they capture the will of the people the best we can. I think we should see them as actors, political actors that should have a say, but they shouldn't be the first step, and they shouldn't be the ones setting the agenda. In part also because, at least in the case of the CESE, so the third legislative chamber in France that I've worked with, the logic is rarely deliberative. The way they function is through, they come in there as representative of corporate interests. Unions, business associations, they don't come in with an open mind to deliberate about the common good. They come there to defend the interest of their groups. So it's not the logic of deliberative democracy, if you will. It's a logic of aggregative democracy, of competition, negotiation, and it has some merits. I mean, I think we gain a lot of clarity from the obsessive pursuit of just the interest of one corporation or one group. But it has drawbacks as well, because you're not allowing the possibility for changing your mind, for learning, for honest, truth-oriented conversation. And some of that is also very much needed if, as a group, we are going to go towards a future that we can all be on board with.
Let me just ask one more question, and then I think we already actually have some questions in the Q&A. And this is more just like a question of personal interest too. Given everything that you've just said, what do you think about the secret ballot? So one of the things I'm interested, because you talk about it a little bit in the book, and then until basically 1870s, elections were not separate from assembly context. People would gather together. You would see everyone vote. In fact, most people's votes were public because not everyone was literate. And so the ballots, for example, would have colors or signs. And it made voting a deliberative context. And there are all sorts of great historical reasons why, of course, we made the ballot secret, and it was to protect people from coercion, from their employers and stuff like that. But I'm curious just to hear you think out loud, whether there's something about the secret ballot that actually kind of changed what electoral democracy could have been. Where there's a version, I guess I could imagine historically, that's actually closer to what you're describing. And like you point out, it so hinges on these little devices that we use, these kind of particular institutional decisions we make about how we run a process.
Very interesting. So John Stuart Mill used to think that we should vote publicly. Actually, I'm not following that view. That's where I stay a liberal. I do think we should, in the privacy of our souls. Maybe because I'm a woman, but I just, as long as the world is not perfectly equal, there are too many things that can interfere with your choice. The only space you have to determine what you truly think is the secrecy of your ballot. And maybe you say, well, that's what damaged, in a way, the deliberative nature of these moments of voting. Well, yes and no. I wouldn't blame the secret vote. The secret vote is a symptom of a problem. It's not the cause of the problem. The problem is inequality of powers between men and women, between rich and poor, between husband and wives, between whites and blacks. And so absolutely I think you need to keep the secret ballot.
Great.
But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a deliberation ahead of time where people will de facto reveal some of their preferences. I mean, but the idea is that you can play the devil's advocate, you can say things that you don't think. I mean, there's an element of exploration in the deliberative phase, and if it's a deliberation setting where there's true freedom and respect, and you're not, and some degree of perhaps anonymity, so that you can try out some thought that you may regret later and then not be judged. And then it will inform your ballot, and but at the moment of voting, I think it should still be in the privacy of your conscience.
Yeah, literally by drawing the curtain.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead, and we have actually already a couple questions, several questions in the queue from the audience. So let me go ahead and take a first one. This one comes from David Greenberg. And the question reads, please address the value to democracy of enabling robust speech of diverse views, giving voice to pros and cons, right and left political speech. So I guess it's a question about viewpoint diversity.
So I think freedom of speech is crucial to a well-functioning democracy. But I feel like you can see in the difference between different countries, like say France and the United States, which have very different sort of restrictions, that again, there's this trade-off between choice and freedom on the one hand and equality on the other, which is that when you start giving corporations the freedom of speech, in the form of like swamping the public sphere with tons of monies and ads and things like that, you're actually diminishing the equality between citizens, and you're harming the possibility of good deliberation in the public sphere. So I think that freedom of speech is essential, but there's an extremist view of it that I think leads to counter-democratic outcomes.
This one might be a kind of related follow-up to, it's from Haley Elsatz. And the question reads, might you elaborate on the types of issues you argue are appropriate for moments of direct democracy?
Good question. So I think that I'm always tempted to defer to the people themselves to determine the kind of things where they would like to be involved in a mass, at a mass scale. That's why I like things like citizens' initiatives, where say there's a law that's been passed by parliament, a randomly selected one even, say that's not working, like there are maybe a large minority who's not happy about it, or most people are like sort of like annoyed by it, and then some people take it upon themselves to gather signatures, and then they reach a threshold and they can trigger a referendum on that law to determine whether or not it should be recalled or amended or something like that. So that's one example, when the old idea that the people know where the shoe pinches, right? So they should be able to tell the rulers, the representatives, that look, this law pinches, it's not good, it's not working, it's unjust, let's change it, fix it, remove it. I also think that representatives can use their common sense to figure out that when they're planning something really big, a radical change rather than an incremental change, for example, then maybe it's time to consult widely the population, right? So like whether or not to enter the European Union in the case of Switzerland, or whether or not to leave the European Union, as in the case of the United Kingdom, that would seem to me a huge sort of big ticket question that you'd want most people to have a chance to weigh in on. I'd say that I would also perhaps pair this moment of mass direct voting with a form of deliberation, again, the question of what does mass deliberation look like? Well, it's been attempted in the shape of the great national debate in France, where precisely just after the Yellow Vest movements, President Macron had a choice between repression, because they were breaking stuff on the Champs-Élysées and blocking the highways, or deliberation. And he chose a deliberative path, trying to involve the whole population in 2 months long conversation about 4 big topics, including taxation, including state organization, the environment, and democracy and participation, and what it should look like. And so, yeah, so I think that's the idea.
Although if I remember it, those great debates were primarily advisory. So Are there, I'm assuming you would want a tighter connection between a kind of advisory function of those kinds of bodies and a more legislative one, or is that right? Or
Totally right. So the difficulty in my work is that there's a normative component where I envisage a function that's quite demanding, and then my reliance on world examples, which are always much more limited. In fact, there's to this day no mini public that has binding power to do anything, right? So, but I still find it useful as a springboard for my imagination to start from there, right? So the Great National Debate was very, very flawed. It was not at all my ideal sort of form of mass deliberation, but I feel like it's like a first attempt to engage a lot of people at scale on issues of common interest, and of course it wasn't binding because it was too unclear to be even generating a single clean recommendation. And even if it did, the constitution in France is such that there's no way that such a input could have any binding force for now. You'd have to have a constitutional amendment or law at the very least to entrench that. But it's not to say that it had no effect. One of the major outcomes of this great national debate is the Citizens' Convention for Climate that took place the following fall in 2019-20, because among the consultation tool that Macron had used was a series of so-called regional assemblies that were randomly selected. So you had about 18 to 21 randomly selected assemblies of about 100 people each. And interestingly, on the question of the environment, they didn't all, but 12 of them converged on one message, which was we need new forms of democratic governance on issues of ecological transition. And apparently it's this convergence, in part, in addition to the pressure of activists and perhaps his own beliefs and all kinds of examples from abroad, like the Irish Citizens' Assembly that had been very successful just a few years before, that convinced Macron to convene this French Citizens' Convention for Climate, which was a group of 150 randomly selected citizens from all over France and our ultramarine territories, and that they were tasked with the goal of coming up with quasi-law proposals to curb greenhouse gas emissions by 40% of the 1990s levels in a way that didn't trigger the Yellow Vest movements again, in a way that was compatible with social justice. And that's what they did. That's what they did. So this is a real world example of something that wasn't binding, but we could imagine it being binding one day. Because what happened is that to my mind, these 150 citizens demonstrated that ordinary citizens are actually capable of doing the job of elected officials. We live with this notion that such a tough job that you need 20 years of experience but in fact, if you think about it, it's kind of absurd that we think that the qualities that you need to win an election correlate in any way with the capacity of writing good law. That's an assumption that we completely take for granted. None of what they do on the campaign trail translate into good lawmaking. It's promises, and you might say, well, yes, it's at least a policy platform. It's a worldview. But I think these assemblies are capable of generating a worldview and producing laws that bring it into life. So
I know this is one of the great themes of your work, which is on one hand, you believe that there is such a thing as expertise, but interestingly, self-rule is not one of them. That it is in fact something that anyone can do and anyone can learn to do if they're given their participation rights. And it's an interesting picture, and I think it really comes together. And you've just talked about the French example, but I think the real example that to me is at the heart of the book is actually the Icelandic constitutional case. And especially for folks who haven't read the book, if I'm reading your book right, it's the moment where you as a scholar are looking at a real world example of democratic constitution writing, and you describe the book as pumping your intuitions. So can you say more? So say more about that example, and then what do you mean by this real world examples, pumping your intuitions of what people can actually do?
Well, because I sound like a radical Democrat now, but I started as a very conservative one, actually. Because I started from the stuff I learned in a political science department. I started from, the philosophical mindset of like, well, Plato, was right. Conceptual. Don't learn all of that. But somehow, through just formal reasoning and theory, I reached the conclusion that actually, we'd be better off with a representative sample legislating on our, representing us. I wasn't even close to talking about legislation at that point. But in my mind, given the example that were available, I was thinking, well, it's an agenda setting function. It's just saying what the program should be like, but not really enacting it. For that, there was no evidence whatsoever that they could do it, except the case of ancient Greece. But it's so far away, and we don't know how they really do it on a daily basis, and so I wasn't that confident. But then I ran into this example completely by accident of the 2012 constitutional process in Iceland, and that really really opened my eyes to the actual reality that citizens can do so much more, even than just setting an agenda. Because in that case, they wrote a new constitution, so they can write constitutional law. So what happened is that in 2008 they had an enormous financial crisis. They burned 7 times their GDP in just a few months. So the government changed, and some people saw it as the time to rewrite the constitution that no one liked. It had been a leftover, leftover of the Danish monarchy when they transitioned to their independence in 1944. So they thought, we never had the time to write a good constitution. Let's do it now in this moment of crisis. And so they wrote together a sample of 950 randomly selected Icelanders, and they said, okay, who are we? What values do we want in this constitution? And they came up with a series of recommendations. Those were handed to an assembly of 25 not randomly selected, but elected constitutional assembly members. But the interesting thing is that they had run, for elections to this assembly, but all the politicians had been excluded from the pool of candidates.
Of the 25?
Oh, yeah. Because none of the politicians in power were allowed to run for this election because they'd been completely discredited by the 2008 crisis. In fact, Iceland is the only country where bankers went to jail and politicians went to jail for corruption, and so these were not ordinary people, and anyway, it was a small group, so it was not representative in any way of the larger population. But they were pretty unusual. Like, the sample was not a bunch of constitutional lawyers. There was a game designer, a student, a math professor, 2 pastors. There were a bunch of academics, to be honest, so it was a sort of elite group still, but much more diverse than your regular, constitutional council in the history of constitutional council writers. And they came up with the idea that they would write drafts and then put them online for the whole public to basically give them feedback on their draft. So they did that about 12 times. And then this crowdsourced draft, itself written on the basis of recommendations by a random sample, went to a referendum in 2012, and 2/3 of the voting population said, yes, we want this new constitutional proposal as the basis of a new constitution. And then the parliament just proceeded to ignore the whole thing and said, well, the referendum wasn't mandatory and times have changed, the economy is doing great now, tourism is really hot, and why do we need a new constitution? So they shelved it, and it's a great pity, because actually on the substance, I've looked carefully at the text, I've compared it with expert drafts, I've compared it with the original constitution. It's actually a good constitution. I think they would have done well under it, in part because there were provisions for citizens' initiatives, citizens' recall. There was a very controversial, but I think good clause on the nationalization of all the natural resources that were not already privately owned, which would have put an end to the corrupt the fact that oligarchs in Iceland basically exploited the natural resources for free for decades, and now they would have had to pay a rent to the nation. How is that not a good thing? But of course, the economic interests threatened by this clause, did their best to kill the constitutional proposal, and I think in part they succeeded. So mean, it was not the only reason. I'm not blaming just that, but anyway, just to get back to the point is that that showed me that you could do politics completely differently. And not only that, you could do it against the dogmas that come out of political science departments and constitutional theorists, including by people that I very much respect, like Jon Elser, is a wonderful political scientist, social scientist, political theorist, but he wrote books and articles saying basically that, well, when it comes to constitution writing, you're better off doing it behind closed doors, away from popular passions and pressures and participation. And he concluded that on the basis of a comparison between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, during which two methods of constitution writing were tried out, and in the French case, it led to catastrophic series of events because indeed the mob showed up and put pressure on the constitution writers, and so it didn't go well. Whereas in the American case, you had these 55 notables writing behind closed doors, boarding up the windows actually, and in the end saying, look, take it or leave it, and writing the Federalist Papers, lobbying and making sure, and then it ended up with producing the longest constitution that's ever been in place. So it looked like, yeah, actually, we should just repeat the American model. But I think this model is no longer appropriate because, especially in the context of Iceland, there was not a war, it was not a crisis to that extent. And the people are a lot more, I think, in a way, mature. Like they're more confident in their own capacities. They want more light, more transparency, more control. You can no longer shut them out, especially when it comes to writing the very social contract of a nation. So basically the Icelanders said, yeah, we know about Jon Elster, we don't care, we're just going to do it our way. And it almost worked.
Almost. There's a question from an audience member that's exactly about this Iceland example, though. They write, Iceland is a small state with an incredibly insular community. Also, the population, as you know, was less than 300,000 in 2009. How might this have worked in a state with substantially more disagreement between the nations?
Well, that's why now I mostly talk about the French example, because you're right. When I started writing that book, I mostly had the Icelandic example, but halfway through I was almost done with the book actually, and then the French case happened. It's a 67 million people, large state, very multicultural, and they managed to get a sample of 150 citizens of all colors and convictions to come up with a plan to fight climate change, basically, and actually, literally author law-like proposals. So to me, it goes to show, well, we've now made the demonstration that it's not just possible in tiny little contexts that are very homogeneous and non-diverse. It works in larger states as well. So of course, objectors will always ask for more evidence, and that's only natural. So the next step would be to do that in an even bigger state, in an even more fractured or conflictual society like the US maybe. And I think the work of James Fishkin in the US has, he's done these deliberative polls. So it's a type of mini public. They don't produce laws and things like that, but they allow people to deliberate over weekends about very controversial issues, and they produce an enormous amount of movement in the opinions that people hold by the end of the weekend, including in comparison to a control group that doesn't get the deliberative treatment. And so those establish very clearly that people are completely capable of reasoning well, listening well, respecting each other, changing their minds in the face of evidence, in all kinds of contexts, and not just rich Western countries, in Uganda, in Mongolia, and like across the world. So I think people are the same everywhere, and so this model is meant as a sort of it's not meant to be only for tiny rich Western Christian countries.
If I can just build on that question, because I really admire your faith in the people in this book. And so I'd love to ask about So let's take a larger context, like the United States, for example, in which there are just, at least for now, demographic permanent minorities. And the collective wisdom, like what do you do with the collective wisdom of the people in that case that is going to reflect? So, if you took the collective wisdom of the people immediately after the American Civil War, they would have been furious about Reconstruction amendments, for example. So is there a way in your model to mitigate what I'm sure are kind of classic liberal anxieties about tyranny of the majority?
Yes.
So is the collective wisdom that is produced in these mini publics different than, the majority polling that would happen among a majority white post-Civil War America that is struggling with constitutional revisions? Do you have faith even in those kinds of contexts?
Well, it's just that I don't know what the alternative would be that would be so much better and so much safer, and I at any given time, you will have always this kind of dangers for almost any given population. So that's why, again, I'm still a liberal. I do believe in constitutional checks on majority rule. And again, democracy is so much more than majority rule anyway. So you want to have these things that prevent majorities in a moment of irrationality or sometimes rationality, actually, but to do these things that they will regret eventually, hopefully. So you want to prevent that from happening, and you learn from history, you learn from other people's experience, you learn from other people's other countries' mistakes, that okay, there's a set of things we don't want to touch, and within that sort of safe space, you might say, you have to allow for mistakes. You have to allow for mistakes. That's the only way to learn. So as long as they're not too dangerous or too extreme, and that they can be reversed, then there's got to be it's a choice between minority rule and majority rule, or so that's unavoidable. And my hope, my belief is that in the deliberative space, when it's construed well, you allow the minorities to make their case be heard and change the mind of the minorities, which sometimes is just ignorant and or defensive and for the other cases where it's truly malevolent, well, then you just have to, indeed, close certain doors and certain avenues. But if you think of the way, the civil rights movement, or the way the gay community mobilized and eventually gained majoritarian support in the population for the defense of its rights, its recognition, all that, it can be done. It takes generations and very hard work. And some of it is not going to happen in mini publics. Some of it will just happen through classic social, political organizations, social movements, the arts also, like the media, the narratives that are made available to us, because that's sometimes the best way actually to touch people's souls and capacity for empathy. And all of that, I mean, I can't theorize that into existence because it's not something that, these are not institutional things so much as the life and blood of a democracy, right? And I'm just hoping that I'm proposing a structure that will make it possible for this life and blood to circulate more easily, and to have more electricity in it, or something like that. And then at that point you get closer to democracy as a way of life. But I feel like the current structure is not conducive to that. It's the blood gets stopped, it gets stale, it gets, it's not, we're not on our way to democracy as a way of life with the current system.
I admire the courage of that position, which is you'd make the gamble that even the protection of minority rights is best secured actually through winning mass politics, through mass democratic politics, rather than, maybe I'm misinterpreting there. I hear an admirable and courageous stand that it is better to win that battle.
Well, it's just that, give me an example of where imposition by a tiny elite has really worked on the long term.
Yeah.
The examples maybe are, well, look, Japan, well, it took a nuclear bomb and then the annihilation of the Japanese souls for liberal democracy to take root. I just don't think that if that's what it takes, it's just, is it worth it? You take you know, the activism of courts, even that, you know, which is still, it's still a democratic institution in some way because it's part of the democratic structure and all that, but it's also, from another point of view, a very elitist group of 9 people who tell us what to think and where the moral truth lies. Look how well it's worked out in the US now. It's triggered such a profound backlash that now we're going back on a lot of things that we thought were acquired, and so yeah, unless you change people's minds at a level where they actually are on board with it, as opposed to feel like, oh, the elite tell us what to think and what's right and what's wrong, and they call us deplorable if we disagree with them, I don't think it's very sustainable.
I still remember actually when I was younger and people held up the Supreme Court as a hero of protecting minority rights against the majority. This was always the case, for example, like gay marriage. There's always the language that the courts would be the way to protect those rights. But exactly as you say, that was its own gamble against rather than winning mass support. For
and I don't want to sound too, I mean, maybe in some very specific historical contexts, you might not have a choice, and maybe, you know, it's if it's the choice between genocide and deliberation, I mean, obviously,
yeah,
obviously, then I'll prefer to take whatever means are necessary to stop it. But then we enter the realm of I don't know, war or extraordinary circumstances for which maybe my theory is not quite prepared yet. I mean, this is not something I'm looking at the realm of relatively normal politics, you know, which limits perhaps the strength of the theory. But at the same time, I'm not sure that any system is foolproof when it comes to these situations, right? Anything can be destroyed in moments like this.
Maybe just one more question, since I'm watching the time, and this may be an impossible question to answer, but I'd love to hear about how whether you imagine open democracy, which is this beautiful portrait that you've been giving us, whether it would work at a global scale. So are there limits to the scalability? So a lot of the examples you've invoked are happening within the national context, but so much of the conversation right now is about what global post-colonial democracy would look like. Does open democracy have something to say to those who are trying to think through democratizing the globe and not just particular?
I love this question because in the last chapter of the book, I gesture toward that, but I don't have that much time. But I'm so excited by what I see happening. So, you know, a year ago, there was a tiny group of activists that put together a prototype of a global assembly with just 100 randomly selected people from all over the globe. So, you know, and they were acknowledged by COP26. They wanted to have a say on the debate that were taking place there. And I know, I just learned that Jim Fishkin here at Stanford, that's where I'm based at the moment, is going to launch a global assembly with something like 32 countries, 6,000 people selected at random. So it's going to be tried. There's no question that this kind of random selection-based assembly, trying to bring people from all over the globe, is going to happen, and we're going to learn so much from these experiences. At the same time, there's this, I think she's a political scientist from ANU in Australia, Nicole Curato, just gave a very provocative lecture on how we need to decolonize global deliberative democracy. And she criticizes in part the original small global assembly because it was, you know, funded by the West and organized by the West, and there's like this white gaze all the time, and I think we're going to have to have this conversation, but and it will be very flawed, it will be very imperfect, and the dynamics within but we can think through the problems. I think you can bring in so-called political translators. You know, Nicole Doer from Germany has theorized the role of political translators, people who don't just translate, because in those multilinguistic settings you need translation, but also take on the defense of the dominated, the traditionally dominated. So you know, women, minorities, people from the South, so that these hegemonies do not replicate themselves within this deliberative setting. And again, I want to say, however flawed this solution, this approach, I just think it scales so much better than electoral politics. Because imagine if we have a global elected parliament, what is it going to look like? It's going to be Bezos, Zuckerberg, all the people who can afford to watch some Indian billionaire and some Saudi billionaire. It's going to be awful. It's going to be full of white men or the locally dominant ethnicity of other parts of the world, rich people who can afford to, be visible in a way that attracts the right votes, the relevant votes. And, forget about the wretched of the earth. Like there's an entire, like the 99% of the world will not be represented in such places. In fact, this is what happened at the UN. This is what happened in the COP, various COPs. So if you want to fight, the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, all of that, I think it will have to involve some mechanism of random selection. And I'm not saying open democracy will be the model, but it's one model. And for me, the key is the randomness of the selection process.
And you would, I like the way that you put it, which is that, again, you would still put your faith or make a better gamble on a global mini public of some sort rather than just holding global parliament. I think it's a nice summary of
that. I don't know that one absolutely, because there's nothing there yet except very dysfunctional global institutions that maintain the status quo, and I just don't see how we get from a better world from there. I just don't. Maybe I'm slightly more optimistic at the national level somehow, because I see how my own country right now struggles, and it struggles in ways that are actually somewhat positive. I think that I see real change, and so maybe that. I mean, I'm a theorist primarily, so this vision of open democracy, I like it pure. I like it, but I do think that in practice, hybridity might be the solution, because the politicians will resist being kicked out, and some of them are actually quite good and useful, and so we probably have to work out some status quo and some modus vivendi until either we go over to a new system or anyway.
Let me hand it back over to Jessica, who I think is going to close us.
Well, thank you both for this really rich and compelling discussion. It was really wonderful and so informative and really just really inspiring in a lot of ways. So thanks to our audience for engaging, and just wanted to mention our next Touchstones of Democracy conversation is in November on Chilean constitutional reform. And that will feature Camila Vergara from Cambridge University and Thomas Klubach from UVA. So thank you for joining us, Kevin and Helene. Thank you very much.